Crypto Caesar, Caesar Capital. Hope you're well. It's the 20th of April 2024, and we are going to have a look at the Bitcoin chart today. And we're going to consider Bitcoin cycles and mania phases. But before we could do that, I think the best thing to do is to start sort of at the beginning and have a look at the Bitcoin 4-year cycle and where we are really in the cycle at the moment, because it's, extremely arguable to say that we are somewhat ahead of schedule. The first reason why is because Bitcoin has never breached its previous all-time high prior to the halving, which we've done. And Bitcoin has never breached its all-time high prior to the midpoint, which we have also done. Excuse me. So it's arguable to say that this cycle could be a little bit different to the other cycles. And it certainly could be argued that we are a little bit ahead of time than we are of previous cycles. And if we are ahead of time of previous cycles, then certainly it becomes more arguable, does it not, that we might not follow the traditional 4-year cycle. So the traditional 4-year cycle is not the halving cycle. The halving cycle is measured in blocks mined. So every 210,000 blocks, there's a new epoch, which creates a new cycle, the halving cycle. Sometimes it's around 4 years, sometimes it's not. But it's kind of close to 4 years, but it's certainly not the 4-year cycle. The 4-year cycle is in fact measurements from each peak of each cycle to the next peak, to the next peak. But more importantly, the lows of each cycle. And in the chart you're looking at now, I have mapped out the peaks and the lows. But the most important thing really for someone who is interested in cycles is that we look at the lows of the cycle, because each low represents the end of one cycle or the death of one cycle and the birth of a new cycle. And you can see here in the chart, we have these bold vertical lines, and they represent each low of each cycle, okay? And as I said, the low of each cycle represents the death of one cycle and the birth of another. And each, from low to low, if you measure from low to low, they are also 4 years. So we've got the peak to peak of 4 years, but also the low to low of around about 4 years. So each one of these lows, if you measure each low to the next low, is 4 years or thereabouts by, a couple of weeks really. So Bitcoin has followed this sort of since inception, a clear 4-year cycle from peak to peak, but most importantly from low to low. And in each cycle, there is a midpoint, okay? And the midpoint essentially just marks out the halfway point of the cycle. So you have the death of one cycle and the rebirth of a new cycle, which takes, of course, 4 years. But in the middle of that cycle, there is a midpoint, which basically is about 2 years, okay? And what's evident from the Bitcoin cycles is that Bitcoin has never breached its previous all-time high prior to the midpoint. So you can see here the first cycle, its peak, then its low down here. This was its ultimate peak, but this was the midpoint of the cycle. And you can see Bitcoin starts to breach its all-time high or its previous all-time high at the midpoint. And again, you can see here in this midpoint, Bitcoin starts to challenge and breach its previous all-time high at the midpoint. Here again, we have the high, the low, and then at the midpoint of the cycle of 2020, what was Bitcoin doing? At the midpoint, it was doing exactly what it did in the other 2 previous cycles. It was challenging its previous all-time high at the midpoint. So what's quite clear in 3 previous cycles is that Bitcoin has always challenged its previous all-time high at the midpoint of each cycle, okay? And that's quite important because Bitcoin has is in a very different scenario this time round, because the midpoint, of course, in this cycle is around about Q4 2024, end of October, November time 2024. And what a lot of analysts, including myself, were expecting was that Bitcoin would grind up and start to challenge its previous all-time high around about the midpoint, so in Q4 this year. But it did that very, very much sooner than a lot of people anticipated, including myself. So in fact, we started to breach the all-time high, and we got 75k around about the 11th of March of this year, which was significantly before the midpoint. So therefore, it's quite arguable, really, that Bitcoin is a little bit ahead of time this cycle, and it might not be following the 4-year cycle, finding a peak, as it were, 4 years after the last peak. And if it were to follow the previous 4-year cycle, Bitcoin would be looking to find a peak around about the Q4 2025, this area. But if Bitcoin it goes on a parabolic move from here, the likelihood of it continuing to the upside until October 2025, I think, is unlikely, because the sheer velocity of the move of Bitcoin, it cannot sustain that sort of move for a continued period of time. So there is this issue now that we could potentially have what a lot of people are calling a left translated cycle. There is the possibility of us having a two-peaked cycle, and we can come on to that in a moment. But what's interesting about the situation we're faced at the moment is there are two things which are very different in this cycle, which I mentioned at the beginning. Number one, Bitcoin has breached its previous all-time high prior to the halving, which it's never done before. And number two, and most importantly, Bitcoin has breached its all-time high prior to the midpoint, which it again has never done before. So what can we make of this? Well, I think what we could do, which might help us a little bit when considering parabolic moves of Bitcoin, or the parabola phase, or if we could call it the mania phase of Bitcoin, is when Bitcoin goes into these mania phases, that mania phase usually lasts for a certain period of time. As I said a moment ago, no asset can sustain, a really powerful move to the upside for a sustained period of time. Okay, so it usually tops out after a period of time. And I would argue that the mania phase begins really at the point where Bitcoin breaches its all-time high. So looking back here in 2017, of course, Bitcoin was, as it always has done previously, started to breach its all-time high at the midpoint of the cycle, and then it went on this parabolic move. Same as it did back in 2013, breached the previous all-time high at the midpoint, then it went on this parabolic move to the upside. And again, in the third cycle in December 2020, breached its previous all-time high, and then went on its parabolic move to the upside. So I think it's arguable to say that the mania phase begins at the point when Bitcoin breaches its previous all-time high and goes on these parabolic moves. Breaches its all-time high, goes on this parabolic move, breaches previous all-time high, goes on this parabolic move. So the question then, I suppose, we have to ask ourselves is, how long has Bitcoin previously remained in these mania phases in history? So the best thing we can do is map those out and measure those out in previous cycles. This is a different chart, but it's still Bitcoin on the weekly. This is the Bitstamp chart, not the BLX chart. So here we have the mania phases, which I've mapped out on this chart, so you can see them. And you can see how these mania phases start. So again, here we are, same place, breaching previous all-time high, going on its mania phase, breaching previous all-time high, mania phase, breaching all-time high, mania phase. Okay, so we've got these three previous mania phases to consider when taking into account how long do we think Bitcoin is going to remain in a mania phase, how long can that be sustained, or how long has it been sustained previously? And what's actually very interesting when you look at this is that the mania phases for Bitcoin previously have all been very similar in time. So this was the first mania phase back in 2013 through to 2013. And this mania phase lasted 315 days. So from the point of which it breached its previous all-time high to the point of which it found its peak was 315 days. Here in the second cycle, once it breached its previous all-time high and started to consolidate, that's the point of which we're measuring. It took 287 days ultimately to find that peak. So the mania phase in the second cycle was 287 days. The mania phase in the first cycle was 315 days. In the previous cycle, again, breaching previous all-time high, going into its mania phase, this mania phase lasted 308 days. So that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because all three of the previous mania phases have lasted pretty much about 300 days, give or take a few days either side. So if we were to print a left translated cycle, and if the mania phase has now begun, because we are technically now, we've breached the all-time high, we're consolidating under the all-time high, and it's arguable now that Bitcoin could start its parabolic phase to the upside. And if Bitcoin does do that, then if Bitcoin remains in this mania phase, as it previously has done in the three previous cycles, it would remain in this mania phase for around about 300 days. Now, of course, we don't know that that's exactly what's going to happen, but it's quite an interesting task to do, to have a look, because it might give us an idea when we get to this point in time to sort of maybe become a little bit cautious about our positions, and start being a little bit more defensive around our positions, and potentially taking some profit. So we started this mania phase on the 11th of March. We're now consolidating under the previous all-time high. And if we go on this parabolic move, and if we were to remain in this mania phase for about 300 days, that would take us to around about January 2025. So it could be, I think, an interesting, or at least a good tool to take away with, or something in the back of your pocket to take away with, to think about where we might be, or where the price is come Q4 2025, because if we have gone on this big parabolic move to the upside, it could be that once we get to Q4 2025, we could be stalling out somewhat, and it could be looking like we get a top. The other possibility is that we come down and we consolidate for a longer period of time, and then we start moving up. That would fit more, of course, with the 4-year cycle peaking out in sort of Q4 2025, or we could potentially have a two-top move, a little bit like we had back in 2020 through to 2021, but also a little bit like we had more so back in 2013, where there were these two peaks, these two very parabolic moves to the upside, which fitted quite well with the 4-year cycle. So that would look something, like this, but something to take into account. But I think we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here. But what I think from this video is it's quite interesting, really, when you have a look at it, that essentially Bitcoin remains in these mania phases for or has historically remained in these mania phases for 300 days. So if we start moving up hard to the upside come the next few months, then I think we've got to be a little bit cautious about what might happen in Q4 2024. And certainly if we have been rallying continually to the upside for 300 days or so, I think that caution has to be exercised at that point, and potentially one should start looking to take some profit. But anyway, we shall look at that when we come to it. For me, markets are more about timing than anything else. There are lots of other things we can look at when we come to that point to make a decision as to whether it's time to start taking some chips off the table. But until then, we shall continue to monitor the market. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to join the group, links in the description. Send us an email through the website or DM me directly on Twitter. Please like, please subscribe, and I shall see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.